Welcome to all. We have well over 200 participants from about 40 countries, as far as we can tell, and an amazing line of speakers. So many thanks for joining us today. I just want to highlight that this is our third webinar, and it has been co-organized jointly by DPU, the Habitat International Coalition, and the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center. Many thanks to all of them. Before we start, I just want to say thank you, very big thanks to many people working behind the scenes, which include those that have volunteered to offer translation and interpretation, including our colleague Barbara Lipietz from DPU, Mari Balou, Álvaro Puertas, Irene Fuertes, Eduardo Cabré, and Sofia Torres from the HIC, the Habitat International Coalition General Secretary, as well as Claudia Rangel from HIC Latin America. We also have the support of two colleagues from DPU, Alexander McFarland, in charge of the DPU communication team, and also Julia Wesley from DPU and a research associate of our program Urban Know, Knowledge in Urban Equality. And last but not least, also a very big thanks to Andrea Klingel from SLARC, the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center. Just a few reminders in terms of housekeeping. We have interpretation available in French and in Spanish, so you can choose the channel. If you have any questions or any comments, please remember to use the Q&A and the chat functions. So before we start, I would like to just remind ourselves about why we're having this conversation and why it matters. The first reason is probably obvious to all. We know that after a low start, we have witnessed a sudden rise of more than 40% increase in the number of coronavirus cases across Africa, and also in the number of deaths. Although we know that the actual number in both cases, death and cases, are likely to be highly underrecorded. Very recently, also, the World Health Organization has warned us that the number of cases in the region could rise up to 10 million people over the next 3 to 6 months, unless very swift preventive measures are taken urgently. We also know that the impacts of the crisis are likely to affect the urban poor disproportionately due to high levels of vulnerabilities caused by malnutrition, pre-existing conditions such as HIV, under-resourced health systems, and more generally, a context in which most of the protective measures advocated to prevent the spread of COVID-19 are just not doable for a vast majority of women and men, girls and boys living in informal settlements or working in the informal economy. But while COVID is regarded and talked about as a unique global crisis, it is important to remember that Africa has endured similar massive crises, health crises, over our lifespan. However, and to a large extent, the impacts of those crises have been rendered invisible by the rest of the world, at least beyond the point in which external support was mobilized in the form of humanitarian assistance, which we know in many cases reached the region quite late. We think that it's time to learn from Africa and to acknowledge that many countries, cities, local governments, and communities across the whole region have significant experience and learning in dealing with massive health crises. The purpose then of this discussion is to understand what can we learn from such experiences, not just as a means to respond to the humanitarian side of the crisis, but as a window to tackle deeply entrenched inequalities that pre-exist the emergence of the crisis. So without further delay, I would like to invite our first speaker, Annie Wilkinson. Annie is an anthropologist specialized in urban health. She has worked extensively across West Africa and particularly in Sierra Leone, looking at how emergency humanitarian and epidemic response works on the ground. Annie, the floor is yours.
Okay, so epidemics can shine a light on inequalities, and we're all seeing the way in which they can do that really dramatically with COVID-19. But I think an important point to note is for many people living and working in informal settlements and with communities at the sharp end of these inequalities, that these are not new revelations. So a question that we need to keep in mind in thinking about what will be the long-term effects is, why have these inequalities been ignored until now? So epidemics can be windows, but they don't necessarily do much about overcoming those barriers. I think part of the window of opportunity, though, for an epidemic is it relates to the scale and the scope of an epidemic or a pandemic. So how these suddenly these everyday health risks that people face in marginalized communities suddenly become a problem for everyone and a problem for us all. So that's not necessarily that the power, I think the power of a pandemic comes partly because it can make the inequalities and the vulnerabilities somehow more relevant to other people. So that's not necessarily motivated by concerns about social justice and inequality. It can be motivated by concerns about people's risk to other people. So I think that's important. Now, just looking back then, with that in mind, looking at some of the recent experience about urban epidemics, and particularly in Africa, I think it's not necessarily clear. So historically, there have epidemics and infectious disease and have been very, the relationship between epidemics and infectious disease has been central to kind of some of the urban planning and urban development, not always with social justice as a motivating factor, but that it has been there. But if we look at recently about there are a rising number of epidemics that Africa and the rest of the world have experienced that have an important urban dimension. So for example, yellow fever in Angola, the West African Ebola outbreak, plague in Madagascar, and now COVID-19.
En Madagascar y ahora el COVID-19. Todo esto.
Sorry, the translation came up. All of these have urban elements, and all of them have the urban elements are kind of, there is the underlying kind of conditions of inequality and poverty which are driving some of the epidemics in these environments. But I have not found, sorry again, but looking at the evidence in terms of long-term positive effects on inequality as a result of some of these outbreaks, there isn't actually a lot of evidence on long-term kind of on long-term changes to do with reducing those inequalities, which is kind of worrying. And I think whilst we're all discussing this for COVID-19, we need to also be thinking about how and why some of these, again, epidemics that have been recently experienced related to inequality, related to urban environments, why they haven't caused the change that we might want to see. So two final comments on that. I think perhaps it's too early. Often these kind of changes take a long time. We want to see results instantly, but actually often it's kind of slower social and political processes that happen. So perhaps it's too early. But also, a problem I do see is that you see a lot of these kind of lessons learned reports after epidemics, and they tend to focus on the health system reforms that are needed, or the reforms that are needed for epidemic preparedness and response, but they are largely detached from really understanding the social determinants of health and inequality which drive vulnerability to epidemics. So I think going forward for COVID-19, we need to recognize the politics of how epidemics and pandemics are framed, who's deemed to be at risk and who is vulnerable. And we also need to kind of look at recent experience and potentially and about how inequality and vulnerability have been detached from health. And so going forward, I think combining action on social justice, urban planning, and health and epidemics is going to be key to bringing about the changes that we're all wanting. I hope that's me done.
Wonderful, Annie. Thank you so much. And I would like to invite our second speaker, Ira Conte.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody.
Wonderful, Ira. So Ira is the president of the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor in Sierra Leone, but has been very, very much connected with the work that many other federations are doing across other parts of Africa under the umbrella of SDI, Islam Dwellers International. We're really happy to have you with us, Ira. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I think I'm very happy to share my experience. Of course, I think it is good we are sharing our experience so we can understand and learn more from other people. I think what I understand now is the lessons we've already learned when we've got the epidemic. The first speaker have just explained some of the things that we think are giving us the problem within community. But let me just highlight on the 3 lessons we've learned. One of the lessons learned is we are talking of community involvement. Community involvement is very, very necessary and key in everything that we are doing. That we are not seeing from the first epidemic we started in 2001-2002, which is cholera. They just start at the higher level without involving the informal settlements to see how best we can involve ourselves in this particular work. But at the end of the day, it was good that we, the community that are living in informal settlements, agreed that this is a fight that we need to fight together, how we can do this. So we call up a meeting, that's the method we use. We call up a meeting and talk to all the stakeholders we have within communities and make sure we talk to some of those structures that we have within communities. And then we start to arrange on how we can tackle these situations within our informal settlements based on the information we are having from the higher authorities, because they can come down and reveal those informations, and the way they are saying it cannot be understood by our people within this community. So what we did is to see how best we call up meetings, call up the structures we have in each communities, explain to them what are the danger we have within this epidemic we have. And with that, we call on them, giving out information to community people, how this epidemic is dangerous to our community. If we allow it to go, if we allow us not to involve to it, how can that damage the communities and also lost a lot of life within communities? So we agreed that when we receive the message from the central government, we have to digest it down so that our community people can understand this particular thing. I think that's the first one, which means we are not being involved in some of this epidemic that is happening. So at the end of the day, we are going to have a lot of problem marginalizing informal settlements and being part of that particular fight to see how best we've done it. That's we've already learned. And it also goes to the second one again when we have the Ebola. The Ebola struck up again, and then they said they are going to start to do the ministers, the parliamentarians, all went to communities to see how best they can push these things. But at the end of the day, it doesn't work well. And then we call up a meeting with the ONS, that's we, the informal settlements. Now let's see how best we can sit, have our own idea, our own thoughts. Our first lesson we should have learned is involving the community to participate in a particular thing. But that was not done. And this second one, again, you are still doing it. So let's learn from our first lesson. So we come on board, we decide and arrange that we are going to take up this responsibility, going down to our communities, talk to the same structures, disseminate this message in our various languages so we can understand how this epidemic is going. So then we start to see how best the involvement of communities is very important in some of it that is happening. On the third one, again, for this epidemic, for the coronavirus, it has also happened again. But thank God to the mayor we have, she played fast, call up the informal settlement to see how best we can join together and have a clear information how we can spread within communities. So she has learned from the lessons because she was part of the Ebola team that provided Ebola, and she learned that without the involvement of the informal settlement, it can't work. And that's what we all learned. Marginalization of informal settlements and not involve the community to participate with the work we've been doing. The second one is information sharing. It is very difficult for them to understand this to the informal perspective. we that are living in an informal settlement, not all of us are well educated. Some of them are educated but cannot understand some of this deep English they are saying at the higher level. So at the end of the day, it is very difficult for people at the informal settlement to understand what this particular epidemic is, how it is more bad to people living in an informal settlement. Like for instance, we are talking of the social distance. You can't just say social distance for 1.3 meter. They don't understand what is 1.3 meter. You need to involve those that are living in an informal settlement so we can transmit that information or transfer that information to our own context. That's when you say social distance, for you not to touch person, for you not to touch people. Because in our settlement, it is very, very key that you can't have 1.3 meter distance. No. So we stretch our hands. That if we stretch our hands, that's the distance we have to take, which has to be understood by the people living in those communities. So the other thing we've learned is message that we transform into this informal settlement. We can't just say it in English. We have to go down to the dialect that we have in this country. One is Creole and the other languages we have, so people can understand. But it has to be a straightforward information. What is being said in English has to be said in different languages, and it has to be the same information, so everybody will understand the information that we are saying. So at the end of the day, the other lessons we learned is how to transmit the messages we have from the epidemic, how that can be transformed to our people living in an informal settlement. And the other one again is we need to learn is participation. Yes, which is very, very key. Even though, yes, we've sat together and make sure we have a plan, transfer this information to these people. We've already done that. How can we participate? So we can learn from our lessons, then we can practice this one if we have another epidemic. We thank God when we have the coronavirus. We've set up a CDMC in all these communities. We have structured that within these communities. So for us, because we've learned our lesson that we should not leave behind, and then we have to transform this information of what we have to that particular one. So we involve ourselves to participate in this coronavirus fight. What we did is to make sure that we have big meetings. We have meetings with various stakeholders, set up proposals, how we can transfer, even proposal without giving money, but to see how best we can participate and make sure that we fight the corona fight. What we did is to have meeting first and make sure we explain to them, with or without funding, we have to make sure we fight the fight because it's for our informal settlements. And then we participate. So some people come on board as volunteers, understand how to disseminate message from one language to another, how some people can take megaphone. We want to participate. We want to make sure every 4 corners of our communities need to hear this particular message and understand exactly what we're saying. So it is very, very good. So for us, the lessons we've already learned is 1, community involvement, 2, sharing of information to informal settlements, and number 3 is participation. And if we have all those 3 lessons and we put it in practice, definitely if there is any epidemic in Africa to see, because I've learned a lot from different countries, I think that will help us to make sure that we are on the same page when the epidemic starts towards the end at which we are going to fight it. So for us in Sierra Leone, this is our problem, and this is the lesson we've learned, which is still going on. I think if we embark on those ones, then we make sure these people are involved as community, then they make sure they are part of transferring information to the people, and then we participate in the process. That will give us the courage to see that we minimize whatever epidemic is coming in our country.
Thank you so much to both. I mean, very important, very important highlights and remarks. I take a couple of very important points from each of you, and is your the way in which you reminded us how important it is to think about the scale and the scope of what seems to be a health crisis, threat, and pandemic, and how that, in a way, defines and determines very much the size, if you wish, of the window opportunity to tackle inequalities. I think that both of you highlighted a very important issue as well around the framing So of course one could wonder, well, why, if things don't change, you know, under other conditions? In the end, we are talking about entrenched and ongoing inequalities. Why would they change during a health crisis? And this, I can see, is a question that has come from many of the participants. And Annie highlighted in regards to that a critical aspect to really craft a window for radical change in relation to pre-existing and ongoing inequalities seems to be very connected with the political framing. While on the other hand, Ira also help us to remember that actually it is important not to think about communities such as those that implement the measures that are thought from the top, but very much as the sources that help the top, help the different systems we have, whether it's health, prevention, many other social and economic systems and decision-making systems, to make sense of what the crisis means and how it is experienced from the ground. I believe we have many questions. I'm trying to at least gather one before we can, let me just see if I can at least gather one. We have plenty. I don't know, Rita, if you want to read, I cannot read your comments, but if you selected a couple, if you can put two questions to both Annie and Ira, please. Thank you.
I have one from Haim Yacobi from the DPU, and he's asking, I would ask on whether the term COVID-19 crisis is relevant. In many cities, especially in the global south, the crisis is a permanent phenomenon, and the pandemic just exposes it. Hence, if you will be asked to pick one fundamental mechanism of coping with the COVID-19 these days, what will it be?
I would suggest, would you like to both say just a few words in response to that question? And then, of course, we will have more time for debate at the end.
I can say something on that. I completely agree. The framing of crisis is very subjective, and lots of people, everyday life is a crisis. I think that becomes really important when you, particularly in terms of short-term responses to epidemics, and we see this time and time again. You saw it in West Africa during Ebola, you saw it again in the DRC outbreak of Ebola, where it would actually breed mistrust between people and the authorities, because they'd say, why are you suddenly so concerned about this disease? We are sick with all of these things every day. We face, in DRC, there's a conflict going on, and now you come and, want us to kind of do what you say. And so I think that what really needs to happen there is we need to get better at listening to people and their priorities, their concerns, their needs, the things that affect them every day, and those kind of struggles. And obviously, if we can do better at listening to them, empowering them in all the ways that Ira was just talking, and reducing those kind of everyday crises, then we're making people less vulnerable to bigger shocks, and we're also kind of building the trust that actually you need to respond to epidemics and shocks.
Thank you, Annie. Ira, would you like to add something to that?
And as Annie has just said, and one of the great things that she said is the same thing we're having, is building trust of those who are going to take lead on this particular coronavirus. Because we've seen what has happened during the time for the Ebola, and then now again we have the coronavirus. So because as they normally say, the coronavirus is dangerous than the Ebola, but it's quite different from how they are treating the Ebola and the coronavirus. Like for instance, we're talking of the marginalization, how they are treating people that are living in an informal settlement. When we're talking of quarantine, it's quite different as how you are treating people that are living in a formal area. So that's the gap for us to have trust between those who can lead to see how best we can understand this particular thing that It's general. So you can't go to informal settlement for quarantine, and then you go to huge amounts of police and soldiers just to tackle for quarantine. But when you're moving to formal sectors, you make sure you just go to ambulance, so mute, people are far away. Then you can talk politely to those you want to quarantine. So that's the gap, except we need to understand, people speak and understand how they feel and how they're accepting these informations. Then it can understand that this is the way we fight. Because if we don't give our input, whatever solution comes up, if it doesn't fit us down there, definitely, and if our voice is not there, it will be very, very easy for us not to listen of exactly what is happening in that particular place. I think that's one I showed a clear example for Thompson Bay. When there's a crisis, Thompson Bay, they went there so harsh, and then they said, no, okay, let's call our chairperson. If he knows about this, then we can understand. So they called me, and I went there, and then I said, this is not the way you have to approach. You have to calm down and talk to them. Let them understand the dynamics of what you want to do. Then they can understand. If you don't, definitely there's a problem. So I need to explain, and some people come out, we explain to them for them to understand. So as long as we understand on the language we think they can understand, it was so easy for them to do the quarantine. Then at the end of the day, we have a result. I think that's what we're up to. So we can have trust on those who are at the top. If not, there will not be any solutions if our involvement not there.
Thank you so much, Ira and Anani. I'm going to, I know we are slightly pressed for time, so I'm going to shift to the second block and give the floor to Rita Lambert.
And today, now in the second block, we have three speakers, and we're more now looking into the future. And the questions we have posed them is, what key lessons have been learned, and how can assertive actions to address urban inequality be sustained in time and structurally? So to begin with, we have Aditya Kumar. Aditya is an executive director of the Development Action Group. And over the last 15 years, he has worked on post-disasters, post-conflict, and informal settlement upgrading across the world. And his practice very much focuses on intersectional partnerships, strengthening community action, and housing policy. So Aditya, I'll give the floor to you.
So maybe just to kick off, so unlike the AIDS pandemic, what's been quite different in South Africa in this instance has been that there's been a lot of openness and transparency around COVID-19, from the presidency down to the health minister. There's been seamless sharing of information from different ministries, both setting out some clear actions in terms of remedies and prevention, but also in terms of the kind of proactive action that government has been taking. So part of the ambition has been to flatten the curve, and that has been in many ways being achieved as a consequence of preemptive lockdown in South Africa. So while this has been really good, the openness and transparency, there have been other actions that have been taken to deal with inequality. For instance, one of the things the National Department has done, which has been very progressive, is they've given a political instruction to halt all evictions of any informal settlement in the country at the moment. Again, this has been a very positive step, although not completely implemented at the local municipality level. It has been a clear political direction and acknowledgement in terms of evictions. The second piece, which has been very significant, is that government has come forward and clearly admitted that not enough has been done to deal with the issues of land, housing, poverty, inequality over the last 25 years. And again, that has been a huge step forward, instead of kind of taking a very kind of high position in this debate, but actually coming forward and admitting that the informal settlement upgrading processes and the issues of land and housing haven't been addressed adequately. So looking forward, there are kind of three areas I think in some ways are very much aligned with the international debate in terms of response to COVID-19 has been. So firstly, it's really been about kind of making sure the short-term interventions are dealt with, which means basic services, water and sanitation, food relief, all of these things are addressed immediately. And there has been some positive steps in this particular regard, in the sense that water tankers, chemical toilets, all kinds of toilet facilities are being installed across informal settlements in the country. while this is being done, there is still a huge challenge of how these services are going to be maintained. So while we're dealing with the COVID-19 challenge, there's also other health and hygiene challenges that might emerge as a consequence of delivering water and sanitation, which does not either get reticulated properly or causes other health and hygiene issues in the future. Linked to this is the kind of second intervention, which is something that like many civil societies organizations are advocating for. So the government has very clearly stated that the density in many of the informal settlements is very high. And there is a need to kind of reduce the density in informal settlements. And while this might not be the most appropriate approach in terms of COVID-19 and might not be an adequate solution or cannot be implemented in the context of COVID-19, it does open up the debate of well-located land. And I think that is a huge debate that needs to be pushed forward much more aggressively if we have to deal with issues of inequality. Part of the challenge has been that many of the informal settlements are located on the periphery of the city, or people have been put into temporary relocation areas on the periphery of the city. And that has been very detrimental to people's both well-being as well as their economic viability in the city. And so in that context, looking at large parcels of land that are state-owned to be opened up, not just for quarantine sites, but also for long-term development of social housing, affordable housing, for housing people in these particular, especially post-COVID-19 context. And then the third piece that's been kind of quite stark in South Africa in terms of class and race divisions is the issue of the private land markets. I think we've also seen that many people who have generationally lived in the inner city, working class people, have been forced to move out as a consequence of private land markets becoming quite exclusionary and generally very expensive for the poor to afford. And I think there is a clear sense or a clear kind of advocacy thrust at the moment to see if the state can start to intervene in the private land market, in what shape and form, and how that intervention to the private land market can start to shape a different agenda when it comes to affordable housing and social housing. And just in terms of closing, just to say, I mean, there are many reasons why informal settlement upgrading hasn't had the impact over the last 25 years. They say that it takes roughly in South Africa about 15 years to upgrade one informal settlement. And there's close to about 3,000 informal settlements in the country. So in this particular context, there are many reasons. And the constant worry is that the resources that are there to do prevention and quarantining efforts and looking at the long-term kind of vision towards upgrading informal settlements, it shouldn't get trumped by short-term knee-jerk responses which do more damage instead of actually providing more support to the poor at the end of the day. Thank you, Adriana. Rita.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you so much for that intervention. And now we go to our second speakers. We have Dr. Joseph McCarthy and Brian Makroma from the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center. Brian Makroma is the Director of Research and Training at SLARC and a lecturer at Njala University. He is a sustainable development planner, and his research has been on improving the living conditions of communities and ecosystems facing land degradation and climate change in Sierra Leone. And we also have Dr. Joseph McCarthy, who's the Executive Director of SLARC and a lecturer also at Njala University. He's an urban planner and a scholar in urban development with background in urban management, climate change adaptation, and disaster risks and resilience with specific expertise on the urban Sierra Leone. I'll give the floor to you, Joseph and Brima.
Basically, I think I must draw a line from Annie's opening remark that epidemics can shine a light on inequality. And therefore, that to me sounds a lot very important in my opening address, especially in discussing about the way forward. In Sierra Leone, issues about health epidemic is not unique to us because we have already had an experience with the cholera crisis in 2012 and also the Ebola crisis in 2014, 2015. But in most cases, the action of government has always been reactive and not proactive. And the question there is whether there has been any lesson learned at all. And I think this is very critical, especially so because even as we are at the heart of the coronavirus crisis, there has always been the mistake of making a one-size-fits-all solution. And in contexts like ours, where informality is more or less a major crisis that we continue to grapple with, we think therefore that we cannot have the same solution for all, but that we have to recognize that there are particular areas where solutions might need to be tailored rather than being general. And I'm talking so much about the issue about vulnerability, especially in urban poor settlements, and also especially the condition of many vulnerable groups within the city. I am especially talking about those kind of settlements that we are very passionate about, the informal settlements where health inequality is so much a major concern. These are places of chaos, generally lacking in terms of social services. They are normally places with great insanitary problems. And so therefore, the Ebola crisis as well as the COVID-19 have laid bare some of the social spatial disparities within the city, especially so when it comes to issues about the transmission of the disease. We have these settlements that are so clustered, so congested, and so therefore it becomes a lot easier for diseases, for the virus to transmit. And these are also places that are hard to reach areas, especially when you think about the topography. Some places are not even connected in terms of ambulances to collect the infected persons. And so we consider that, just like Aditya was saying about issues about planning, there is a whole lot of promise for planning, especially going forward. And we know that because we come from resource-constrained economies, it may be difficult for the government alone to take care of all of these things. But then there are particular actions that can be taken by the government, for instance, in terms of relaxing on tenure security issues, but also relaxing on certain planning laws, and also building capacities to ensure that some of these places are really improved or upgraded, so that once this is done, possibly the issue of vulnerability or exposure to future epidemics can be reduced. The second opportunity I can think about is the idea that we have normally been missing the point, especially in terms of the opportunities of the capacity that exists within informal settlements. Normally, there is the risk of thinking that people living in informal settlements are helpless and that they don't have capacity. But then our work in some of these settlements have shown that the residents themselves are busy collecting data on their own settlements, and they are using this data for their own progress, improving on the very settlements where they live, using their own local capacities, using their own local resources. And we think that this is very, very critical, especially so because the knowledge that they have been using has been a lot fundamental, especially in terms of bringing some level of improvements, working especially with NGOs. And we also think that when we talk about inequality, it manifests itself in different forms. It can be spatial, it can be health, it can be in terms of economic issues, it can be also in terms of access. So looking at the complexity of inequality is very, very critical at a time like this. And for the health system response to really recognize some of these issues to us will be very, very fundamental, especially in getting the equation right when it comes to future epidemics of this nature. But at the same time also, like I was talking about, the government always taking a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. We have seen evidences of the government using lockdown, using quarantine. And that gives the impression that everyone already has a place to live when it comes to lockdown, or everyone has access to resources, at least to sustain themselves within the period of the lockdown. But judging from what happened very recently when we had a lockdown here, it seemed that some people are just a day or two away from destitution, because a lot of them are already vulnerable. And you say they have to lock down for 3 days or 5 days. Just after 1 or 2 days, some start breaking down. And so what is the government doing about this? And how is the government actually tailoring some of these responses to really meet some of these realities in the kinds of settlements we are talking about? So we think that going forward, a lot of lessons really needs to be learned, especially in terms of how to position health systems response or emergency response based on some of these realities. I thank you. I think Brahma will want to say a few more words.
Yeah, so basically, at least going from what had been said within the first session, I think it's also very essential that we're able to actually leverage on some of the key community agencies and possibly be able to also scale up and steer up some of the key bottom-up response that are happening within at the community level. Where most times they are being ignored, and on the basis of what we are seeing moving forward, those elements around community organizations within response framework within those informal settlements are much more critical. So they need to actually be, be supported, in terms of actually providing basic service that they required, that can be able to actually help government measures to actually be able to work within those set of informal settlements to really move forward. And we must also be able to ensure that those areas, as Annie also expressed around some of the key political complexity, that have been some of the key things that have not been learned within those, as far as informality and disease response mechanism or pandemic issues have been actually been there. And most times we only learn about what is coming and fail to actually plan for some of the key uncertainty that are basically around some of the key pandemic issues that often affect informal settlements, as the case may be. So I'll stop there for now. And
thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph and Brima. We have our third speaker, Dr. Sinead Walsh. She's a European Union ambassador to South Sudan and author of Getting to Zero. This is a book that draws from her 3-year experience during the Ebola crisis in Freetown, when she was actually the Irish ambassador and the head of Irish Aid. Sinead focuses heavily during the time on coordination, policy and planning, troubleshooting and advocacy within the national response and at the international level. Sinead, are you there?
I'm here, Rita. I can't turn on my camera, but maybe
we can hear you fine, though. We can hear you very well.
Great. So maybe a few I suppose lessons from Ebola, and greetings first of all to my Sierra Leonean brothers there, and to Annie and others that I remember from my 5 years, not 3 years in Sierra Leone. But also I think like many of you, I'm very much occupied at the moment by the COVID crisis. So maybe a few lessons in the context of your theme around urban inequality that are maybe relevant to both the past and the present crises. I mean, I think it maybe bears saying that, of course, with these crises, you know, the urban-rural kind of inequalities are one thing, but global inequalities are obviously extremely present, as everybody knows. So South Sudan, in the best of times, has one doctor per 65,000 people, so that's about 1.5% of what is recommended by WHO. Oh, my video is working again. So I think one of the equality issues that is very relevant for us for COVID is that during Ebola, we could actually get resources, human resources from abroad. We can't at the moment because I think, like many other countries, there are no flights, and everybody's experts are tied up in their home countries. So this is something we're really struggling with at the moment. I think in countries like South Sudan with extremely low baselines of sort of technical capacity for diseases. So it just, you know, that sort of global inequality kind of, you know, obviously is a baseline that's very difficult to deal with. And I suppose, you know, what we very much found also in Sierra Leone is that, you know, these infectious diseases, they catch you where you are. So the vulnerabilities that you have will be exacerbated. And one of the implications of that is that you can't suddenly catch up and sort of wish that you had well-developed hospitals and so on, and wonderfully well-developed health professionals. You have to actually, you have a real time constraint with an infectious disease. So you have to, on the one hand, try to work with what you have and all the resources that you have, and not try to sort of build huge big hospitals, but at the same time, and I think this is sort of what some of the panelists have been talking about, you know, see whether there are opportunities within the crisis to actually also chip away at some of these inequalities. So just to give you an example, we have very large IDP camps, internally displaced people camps, inside South Sudan. And of course, they're now becoming a huge concern in sort of infection terms, but a lot of those people would struggle with the land rights to go back to where they're originally from. And so, you know, can we also consider that to be an intervention that's relevant to the crisis? Maybe two more points I wanted to mention. A big lesson from the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea is about the underestimation, I think, of the impact of the secondary impacts of the crisis. So we obviously spent a huge amount of time trying to address the virus itself. Actually, you know, when we wrote the book Getting to Zero about the lessons from Sierra Leone, we looked at all the statistics, and actually a lot more people had died from non-Ebola diseases, in excess of what you would expect in a normal year, because we had effectively allowed the health system to shut down, and we hadn't really realized soon enough and reacted soon enough to the secondary health crisis, but also to the implications of the various lockdowns. And I think this is something that we're really seeing at the moment. And in terms of the urban topic, I think lockdowns will have a much greater impact in urban areas, are having a greater impact in urban areas. You know, they're more enforced in urban areas. Urban populations are more dependent on, you know, imported food, in our case in South Sudan, the market, you know, urban areas obviously struggling a lot with some sort of hand washing facilities and so on that may not be as challenged in some rural areas. So we are really facing a situation where, you know, South Sudan is entirely dependent on imported food. Sorry, I should say cities in South Sudan. But at the same time, borders are closing down, and there's all sorts of issues with truck drivers having COVID in the neighboring countries and so on. So there's a huge urban vulnerability that means that we have to be so careful with the impact of the lockdowns on people's livelihoods. And so what we're you know, I suppose one of my main roles in this crisis, as it was also in Sierra Leone, is trying to connect the sort of voices that are coming from the ground, you know, in my case, it would be trying to get the NGOs access to the sort of high-level decision makers, or myself communicate the issues coming from the NGOs to the decision makers that they might not be able to meet directly. And you know, one of the things that we've really been pushing, the high-level task force that we have that's chaired by the Vice President here, is that they need to look at every single lockdown measure very carefully in terms of the benefit on COVID prevention versus the cost on livelihoods, and I think, you know, I think that is that's a point that they do understand, and I think it's particularly relevant for urban areas. And then maybe the last point to say, and others have talked about it as well, I think one of our big lessons from Ebola was how slow we were at two-way kind of communication. We did far too much kind of loudspeaker, kind of awareness raising, and it was only later in the response and some very good work done by some of the panelists in the room, in the various rooms today, in terms of actually listening to communities themselves. What are their strategies? What are their ideas for how to prevent these viruses? Because of course they will know better than anybody coming from outside. And so one of the things that we're trying to do here in South Sudan at a sort of relatively early stage is actually try to work with some local research organizations to get that sort of constant stream of feedback in terms of well, what are the impacts of some of the measures and what are some ideas, because you can't just sort of go back to the government and say we don't want to do this prevention measure and we don't want to do that prevention measure. You need to be able to provide alternatives, because everybody does want to prevent this this disease. So really this is what I sort of try to do is link some of the practitioners with the decision makers, partly to improve prevention and partly to make prevention less harmful for people's livelihoods and people's lives. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sinead. Thank you for those. Thank you to all our three speakers. May I now hand over to Adriana so she can tell us the questions that are coming forward.
Sure. Just to say, we had at the moment 180 participants, 230 at the point, from over 40 countries. The points being made are many, and many interesting questions and debates. So I don't think that we're going to have time to go through the questions, but it was really interesting to see the interaction. Because we are very close to the time of closing, I think that, many of the questions, many of the comments have to do precisely with the issue of communication. Communication not just as a means of disseminating information or prevention measures, but communication as a way of also thinking very carefully, how do we frame a crisis effectively, politically, with room for radical or deep change in a context or in the many contexts where crisis is part of the everyday. So I just wonder if we could have perhaps a final reflection from each of the speakers. Just 1 minute final reflection before we all leave the rooms, as Sinead said. Thank you.
So just, can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
In terms of communication, so one of the amazing things that's happened in Cape Town particularly is the emergence of community action networks. And these are paired neighborhoods, sometimes very affluent, paired up with other very poor neighborhoods, working in tandem to provide all kinds of relief and communication. And that's been very significant in reaching out to thousands and thousands of people and getting input from them in terms of what kind of relief is needed, where the food needs to go, how the food needs to be tracked, how the health and hygiene issues, how the protective gear needs to be managed, all of those things. So that's been really, really amazing. There's other national campaigns going on, which are collating information from close to about 250 odd informal settlements and feeding it into provincial and national governments around water and sanitation. So basic questions that deal with, do you have supply of water? Do you have access to cleaning material for your sanitation units? Is your waste being removed? So simple things that actually framing and collecting data and collecting both anecdotal and quantitative information that can be fed into the system. Between the kind of various civil society organizations, there's probably a footprint in about 1,500 informal settlements. And all of us have pretty much redirected our resources in order to reach out to many of these informal settlements, gather data, gather information, build consensus around what the approach should be in this particular time. And that we're finding to be fairly useful, that in a short space of time, we managed to reach a large number of people across the various organizations in the country. Thanks.
Thank you, Aditya. Brahma, Joseph, and Sinead?
I think the question is very important, especially and the kind of information to send. And this was one of the key issues that's really stalled the Ebola response, especially in terms of the kind of messages that would be devoid of fear, devoid of mistrust, but one that possibly has the potential to give hope to the people. And so a way of framing the crisis in ways that can give hope to the people is so much about attempting, like in the case of the coronavirus disease, to really understand and establish the nature of this particular Ebola crisis. And I think one of the framing which we have attempted to do was really to look at the two from different fronts. And one has been, especially working with our medical colleagues, is that the Ebola crisis seems to be a lot deadly than the corona to us, but at the same time, the corona seems to be a lot more transmittive. And so therefore, understanding and establishing some of these differences will be critical, especially in terms of helping the understanding of the people, the populace especially, to ensure that they do not only see the crisis as one which hasn't got any solution, one which possibly is so much about death, but as well as looking at it as one which can provide hope in the sense that there can be ways of either preventing yourself from it if only you try, but at the same time ensuring that there is already the potential to also recover from it, since by its very nature it's not as much as it used to be in the case of Ebola.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, messages have been a very, messages have been a very, big challenge in terms of how basically some of these messages get down to the community, for community and stuff to be able to actually understand. So it has a much more critical role to play in the whole, crisis process. More especially, the initial messages were coming up, and even how you transition that message as the crisis, a major case situation also increases within the informal settlements. One of the key, challenges that have been there over time. And of course, we have seen that indeed, with the coming of the Federation of Urban and Rural Poor, they'll be also be able to actually establish what we call the KYC TV, and is that particular set of platform that be able to actually move around within the various sort of informal settlements and actually be able to actually understand the different sort of measures or regulation that are being established by government, and how possibly the community themselves can be able to actually protect themselves against any potential, infection rates within those sort of informal settlement. And that would be much more effective for them to actually be able to understand the overall set of messaging and also moving forward.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. Sinead, if you want to give us 1 minute, or
maybe just one point. I think I think COVID is really every time we think we may have some ideas, it comes out with a new trick, and I think one of the really difficult things about communication is obviously, unlike Ebola, there's this very serious social distancing requirement. We also have very strict movement restrictions because of COVID, in terms of even, implementers moving around to deliver messages. And then you also have a great deal of fear. So during Ebola, we used, I would say eventually in Sierra Leone, we got quite good at using kind of, really, supporting and encouraging, leaders and, at various levels to really, have kind of in-depth conversations with community members about this. And a lot of leaders here, and I'm sure in other countries as well, are very, very fearful. And so I think it's a real challenge that we're going to have to deal with, that we have this physical, these physical obstacles, and I think we're just going to have to get a lot more creative. We can, of course, still make a great deal of use of radio and some other methodologies, but I think we're going to have to get much more innovative around the constraints that we're getting. But we do need to somehow bring these leader voices in here, because like every infectious disease, early on you have an enormous amount of stigma, rumors, conspiracies, and all sorts of things that leaders are really best placed to try to dispel. So we're going to have to get creative on how we help them to do that.
Thank you, Sinead. So just to wrap up then, I think the interjections today have really been fantastic and invaluable, and really call our attention to whose knowledge, who's learning the lesson, who's retaining these lessons, because of course we're trying to say who sustains them, and who is imparting them with others. So what is clear is that there are real barriers for these lessons to be shared. And I think one major question here was like the lessons that are formulated, lessons are formulated through reflection. So without reflection, it's actually quite difficult to see how organization will learn for the future. So but reflection themselves need the time and space, which cannot be afforded by all. Moreover, even if they do take place, how are they shared to inform the future? In the Ebola case, I know, Sinead, you had a lot of reflections which focused precisely at looking at where are those reflections housed, and often you wrote that they're housed at the high level, at the WHO level or the international health emergency systems level, and very little is known about national government responses, local NGOs, and even less on the communities who are absolutely critical in the responses. Yet this knowledge is there. We know it. It is embodied, it is lived, but not necessarily is it recognized. And time and effort dedicated to thinking and planning how it can be imparted and transmitted beyond the local level and across generation is necessary. And this is, I mean, Brahma, you made reference to that, and Joseph as well, and Yire, that there is absolutely a need to make visible these kind of knowledges and capacities that exist and give them more the importance that they merit. On the other hand, Yire did bring up this point about translation, that with any knowledge, issues of translation emerge. It's not only translation between languages like we are doing today, the difficulty between Spanish and French, and translation with community and across scales. But even if lessons from previous health crises have been documented, they have rarely been translated into action. And how to make sure, for me, this question is really, how do we make sure that the conclusion from past health crisis events do not become yet again conclusions for future events, but actually introductions, yeah? So translating lessons into action will require more planning, and as Joseph told us today, a hyper-contextual response. So really understanding the context. It needs coordinated action that take all levels into account, and clarity of implementation and resources, and really understanding also to ensure that adequate national and local capacities are there. Finally, what's quite interesting, and this is Adriana's point that she made, which she made at another moment, but this issue that essentially inequalities manifest through the geographies of knowledge and the action of scale. So when an epidemic affecting the global south, it remains local in our popular imaginaries, yeah? And she made the point that actually it becomes inflated to a global scale when it is in the north. Mobilizing also that very scale for action. And Annie, as noted by Annie, the motivating factor here is not social justice, but minimizing the risk of exposure. So really, and also I think Sinead help us to really think about this question of the different standards we apply consciously or unconsciously. I'm looking at the time, so really to keep short, opportunity is there for meaningful reform, but also there's also these dilemmas that are presented as either or situation. Stop the pandemic or improving care, between public health and rights of citizens or individuals. Can these opportunities really tackle multiple fronts? For example, as some of our panels have said, the right to land and housing, sustainability and fairer conditions. So really, as highlighted again by our panelists, the immediate pressing issues like basic services, tackling the vulnerabilities of the urban and the impact of the long lockdown on livelihoods has to be done immediately. Reform needs to be at this everyday level, but again, we need to be able to make through this reform resilience of the whole system. So I would like to end here by firstly thanking very much our speakers for their knowledge and the time. It's unfortunate that the time seems so pressing to elaborate even further, but it's not to leave you without anything, just to let you know that this is recorded and will be retained in our DPU website, as well as in Facebook. And our next COVID series is entitled Crisis in Contested Cities and Divided Societies, and that will take place on the 5th of May. So thank you to all for joining us here at the DPU from all across the globe, and keep safe and goodbye. Thank you.